Hello and welcome to the Swarthmore topic analysis. Resolved, the United States ought to provide a universal basic income. We'll start with going through a little bit of the history of the universal basic income. Thomas Paine in 1795 is credited with starting the first serious debate about the universal basic income. And people have been debating the issue for quite a while, but the distinction between other countries and the United States is that the discussion is dominated by politics. Now, what does that mean? Often, debates are not surrounded upon the merits of the UBI, but surrounded upon the political ramifications and the way that people will perceive it. The straw power passage below sort of expands upon this and talks about how, despite how other countries have been holding referendums, been discussing it for quite a while, the sociocultural substance within the United States means that it's often determined by political ramifications. So, for example, Republicans are very against social spending, so the universal basic income, even if it were to benefit people, often is not discussed or not talked about due to those factors. South Africa is a country you'll often come across in your research, as they have consistently debated it and talked about it for quite a while now and instituted some programs similar but not quite exactly what the universal basic income is. We'll start with some definitions. Now, while the United States may seem a relatively obvious term, the agent question is everything on this topic. The United States does not determine or dictate who is doing the action, i.e. the federal government, the states, the cities, etc. So that question will be pretty central to the rest of the debate for a couple of different reasons. First is uniform versus regional implementation. If the federal government were to do it, it would involve one uniform policy that would be passed, and subsequently the United States federal government would be responsible for then paying the UBI, which we'll get to the technical aspects of in the next slide. If it were regional implementation, there would be a potential that, again, regionally, you would be able to change the UBI based upon the cost of living. So, for example, in New York, where expenses are much higher, the UBI might be UBI might be higher than in Wisconsin or Wyoming, where costs are much less. This is also relevant for the agent counterplan debate. For every federal government AFF debate, there's the state's counterplan, and for every state's AFF debate, there's the federal government counterplan. So understanding the intricacies of these policies are inevitable and necessary to be successful on this topic. These T debates and spec debates will happen. There are contradictory definitions to what the United States is, as you can see below, as the United States can often refer to the states themselves and the federal government, which means that this will be a question that will be asked in debates and one that you have to ultimately take a stance on as the AFF and be prepared to answer. Let's talk about defining a universal basic income. A universal basic income has a litany of different names within the topic literature. As you can see, it's called a basic income guarantee, citizens' income, unconditional basic income, universal basic income, or universal demogrant. Despite having all of these different names, often they come down to just a few characteristics. Periodic, meaning it's paid at regular intervals, so they consistently get paid. Cash payment, it is not in the form of a benefit, i.e. a disability benefit, or some other service in which it is conditioned on you use it for certain things. You can use it for what you want, and you can decide what to spend it on. It's individual, meaning it's paid on an individual basis. Relatively obvious. It's universal. This is pretty critical, and also another question that you have to figure out how to answer. Does universal mean it includes people such as non-citizens, immigrants with visas, etc.? Does it include the rich? Universal is a pretty general term, and ultimately you have to decide what exactly it means in terms of your affirmative. Universal also means that there is no means test, i.e. there's no qualification or standard which you have to meet in order to get the UBI. It's unconditional. It's paid without a requirement to work or demonstrate a willingness to work, meaning it is paid regardless of your status or whether or not you are working. So, a question that often comes up is how the UBI is funded. This is often described as an incredibly expensive program, and it requires slashing a litany of current social services. The question then is, how is the UBI funded if social services aren't slashed? And even if they are, How do you make up for any deficit or remaining money that is required if we were just to hand everyone a check? Now, there are a couple of different answers that the topic literature gives. And another relevant question is how much specification is too much specification. I'll expand upon that. The UBI has often been described as an increase in taxes on just the rich in order to pay for it. But that's not the only way to pay for it. There are also things such as a carbon tax that have been proposed, where we just tax the output of carbon on different companies, and we could use that to fund the UBI. We could tax the oil industry. We could tax the factory farming industry, etc., etc. There are a litany of different proposals, and how much specification is too much specification is definitely a relevant question, because ultimately the affirmative could potentially generate advantages based upon that funding mechanism. And whether or not that's extra topical is a discussion you can have both amongst yourselves and with your lab leaders. A likely spec argument is also how the UBI is determined. This is also an incredibly important question in terms of disadvantages because it often determines the size of the link. As we discussed previously, the UBI has a potential to be different based upon the area you are in if it is regionally adjusted or adjusted to the cost of living. So these are definitely relevant questions, and for the more advanced debaters, likely a spec argument that people will eventually read. Below are prominent advocates of the UBI, and there are definitely people that you should read in your research into the topic. The core topic area is economics. You have to know your economics if you're going to be successful on this topic. There's no question that if you are not prepared to have this debate, you will not be successful because it is one of the most critical portions of this topic. Let's go through a general overview of the arguments both for and against the UBI in terms of economics. The first one is purchasing power. Are people going to spend the money they get from the UBI, or are they going to save it? This is definitely a relevant question in terms of whether or not it ends up stimulating the economy. One of the main advantages people discuss of the UBI that would be able to make up for any economic deficit is that the sudden influx of money and the sudden spending of money means that it would cause a stimulus in the economy. It would cause a stimulus in the economy that would then restart or give it a jump start to incentivize further spending, which also then leads to higher rates of employment and overall economic growth. But another argument against that is that employers could just respond by lowering wages. If you provide a UBI, employers no longer have an incentive to increase wages or pay their workers a decent amount because they know that social services will just take care of whatever deficit in a worker's standard of living. So balancing between the two is definitely balancing between these two arguments is the debate between these two arguments is definitely vast, and you'll find within the VBI starter pack there are cards discussing both of these concepts, both for and against, and that the debate is robust. The next area is an increased access to job opportunities. People need to be able to take risks, but the problem in the status quo, or right now, is that people don't feel the comfort of taking risks because they know that if they do, they could be subjecting themselves to financial insecurity, which creates a pretty sufficient disincentive to not try and start new businesses or take new employment opportunities or move somewhere new because they know that if it doesn't work out, they functionally have no options left, which means that the UBI would be able to resolve that deficit or that disincentive because it means that even if something doesn't follow through or work out, you still have a safety net to default back to. Now, the other important aspect is that a UBI means that there is better access to healthcare and education and other services. People ultimately become more productive because they're no longer as worried about other services because they have the UBI to make up for it, which means that that increase in money means that they can finally get the proper care that they require. That ultimately leads to people being more productive, healthier, and overall a better society. Now, as we discussed previously, the UBI is incredibly expensive. It would require a lot of government spending and is an extension of the welfare state, and there are definitely disadvantages that we'll discuss later relevant to this that the UBI might trigger. Now, the last big negative argument is the work ethic argument. Giving people a UBI decreases people's motivation to work because now they have an excuse not to. They're receiving a check from the government, so there's no real incentive for them to work, especially when employment opportunities are hard as they are right now, which means that the workforce slowly declines, and this is definitely relevant in terms of a big argument you'll find in the topic literature discussing automation. Automation is currently taking over people's jobs, and one argument is that the UBI just gives employers an excuse to fire workers and replace them with automation because they know that they no longer have a responsibility or an obligation to hire these people because of the UBI, and they know that they'll eventually receive money. Let's talk about a particular AFF contention area dealing with dependency. This is a core topic tenet, and it's, again, one of the better arguments because it's pretty unique to the UBI, and it gives them, and it has to deal with the freedom aspect of it. The freedom argument above, if you remember, is that it gives employees or workers the ability to do what they want because they now have a financial safety net. But it goes further than that. The dependency argument also is about recognizing the humanity of employees. If anyone debated the living wage topic, they might remember the Curry article that was released that discussed how a living wage recognized the humanity of workers. A similar concept applies here. A UBI just recognizes that their well-being should not be dependent upon the work that they do. Rather, everyone should be able to have a sufficient life and a financially secure life. And that a UBI is just recognizing that we should not leave people who don't work in poverty to suffer hellish conditions. How does this manifest itself as an affirmative case? The very basics is the poverty argument. The UBI decreases poverty, increases people's overall well-being, which is good. I've found that going to the very basic arguments and the truest arguments in the topic literature are often the best affirmative cases to write. Writing an in-depth poverty AFF is definitely a super threatening case, especially if you know the debate much better than everyone else. The second is that there are traditions of deontological literature that advocate reducing dependency, because when employees are desperate, they accept the worst working conditions, i.e. sweatshops. We can see this is evident all around the world. When people don't have jobs or need ways to sustain themselves, they often subject themselves to the worst working conditions, and this is evident all around the world, both in the United States and outside. The Deont AFF would merely say that dependency and that subjecting people to those conditions would be definitely a rights violation, and that it would be better to give people a UBI and allow them to access freedoms beyond just financial security. Now, the next affirmative is one dealing with the dependency argument, except it's specific to marginalized populations. And the name below also gives a couple of good articles written dealing with this. One example of this is an LGBTQ AFF that discusses how they suffer discrimination in the workplace, but often that discrimination is only accepted because they need that job, as we discussed previously. The same concept then applies that they should not subject themselves to those heinous working conditions, and that this again gives them financial security. The article goes on and makes some other interesting arguments about how if people had this financial security, it also might advance current progressive and radical reforms beyond just the workplace, because people might, once they have access to better health care, they become more productive, and they have more financial security, they can pursue these radical agendas more rigorously, and that also allows them to further advance their cause, which leads to reforms beyond just the UBI financial security and spills over. These arguments are super interesting, and I would highly recommend delving into them. The last one is the environment advantage. The UBI breaks our attitude of needing to be productive in order to secure financial security. Now, this is sort of converse of previous arguments, and it's a sort of play on the work ethic argument. So often, as I discussed previously, negatives will argue that people's work ethic will go down because they no longer have an incentive to be employed. The environment advantage sort of takes this argument and says that it's good and turns it on its head and says that this need to constantly be productive and be employed is part of the reason why we constantly consume and exploit the environment, because we feel the need to be more productive. And this is both a materialist argument in the sense that we would literally stop exploiting more if we had less people employed, but it's also an ideological argument that says that this would break the need or the feeling to always be consuming and productive in the first place. And this is more of a critical argument than the previous ones, but it's definitely a pretty interesting one that has basis in the topic literature. Some of the philosophy areas, again, are very, very similar to the previous one, so I'll go through them quickly. The Augustinian virtue ethics AFF is similar to what I talked about previously, where to the Curry argument, where a proper orientation towards workers requires giving them a basic income just to respect their intrinsic value. The next one is an income dependency argument that is based in, again, more deontological literature that talks about how guaranteed sources of income break the cycle of dependency and create the conditions for freedom. People should be able to do what they want and live the life that they want and not accept terrible conditions. But the second aspect of this that I didn't discuss previously was that this also then allows people to access the political process more. As we can see with this past election cycle, a lot of people are locked out of the political process. Democracy is not at its peak because people are locked out along class and racialized lines. Often these two are intertwined. And if you were to give a UBI, it would allow people to be heard in the political process more and inject their voices into the policymaking process, which is important because for a litany of different ethical theories that ultimately all believe that people are what constitute the government's legitimacy, and therefore their voices are necessary in order for the government to be legitimate in the first place. Now, let's talk about some of the policy and more utilitarian consequentialist advantage areas. You can access a lot of different advantages using poverty as your internal link. Now, internal link is a little jargony, so I'll explain it. An internal link is simply an argument as to why if X is true, it causes Y, and if Y is true, it causes Z. So, for example, if the UBI were implemented, it would lead to a decrease in poverty. If poverty were decreased, that would then lead to a better healthcare system. So poverty is the internal link to healthcare. It is what causes healthcare to occur as a consequence. So you can access a lot of advantages using the poverty argument. The first one is a drug abuse argument. Increased rates of income lead to decreased use in drugs. It's a pretty simple argument, and you just need to win that drug abuse is bad, which there are a laundry list of cards in the topic literature. On the flip side, there are definitely criticisms of this argument. People say it's biased against certain populations. An example of an author is Michelle Alexander, who say that despite reported rates of low-income neighborhoods, which are often black and brown neighborhoods, that they use more drugs, there are actually relatively equal rates of use among these higher income and lower income neighborhoods and between white and black populations. So there are definitely criticisms of this argument that say that drug use is just based upon economics, and says that that's often intertwined with race and that those discussions are often very biased. The next argument is healthcare. This would manifest in perhaps a disease advantage in which if people's income increased, that means that they would have access to better healthcare. They wouldn't get sick as often. There would be less diseases. And there's definitely advantages you'll find within policy AFFs that discuss why disease is bad and would definitely lead to widespread harm. The last one is education. An increase in income means that kids won't have to work. Most kids in low-income neighborhoods have jobs in order to supplement their parents' income. Now, if the UBI were implemented, parents would be able to allow their kids to go to school, or at least allow their kids to focus more time in school, which means that they would get a better education. Again, if we go back previously to what I said, it leads to a more productive society, and it also leads to just overall better economic growth and better well-being. There are a couple of other AFF contentions that don't deal with poverty directly, but still have to do with economics. The first one is an economic stimulus argument. If we again remember what I said previously, if people start spending more using their purchasing power, it would cause an economic stimulus and jumpstart the economy. You can generate advantages based upon our current economic fragility and how the UBI might be able to solve that. The next one is overpopulation. More developed societies in their later stages tend to have lower rates of population growth. Japan's a good example of this, although not completely equivalent to the United States, as they have higher incomes and their overall well-being of society is better. They have an incredibly low birth rate, and in fact, their death rate actually exceeds their birth rate, which is a current problem for them. But for the United States, which is currently growing at a very rapid pace, might be necessary in order to offset the overpopulation that's currently occurring. Now, the problem with all the previous advantages that I talked about, absent dependency, is that a simple increase in income is easily solved by other advantage counterplans, which we'll get to in a later slide. But that's why I believe that the dependency advantage is distinct from these economic arguments, because it has to do more with value reorientation, the way we treat workers, and the dignity we treat workers, which means that the philosophy angle against these counterplans is definitely a very strategic one. Next, we'll move on to the NEG Disadvantage Areas. So we've discussed this a couple of different times, but I'll explain this argument with a little bit more nuance. The UBI is incredibly expensive, but the disadvantage, or the argument as to why this is bad, can manifest itself in a litany of different ways, which is why it is incredibly important that you read what they are saying. Don't merely hear the word econ disad and pull up your generic blocks. Each disad can be unique in its own way, which is why it's important to look at the details of the disad. An example of this is how one disadvantage could be about how excessive government spending excessive government spending then leads to economic instability because maybe it destroys the dollar value. But on the flip side, another argument could be that the UBI, because it's incredibly expensive, destroys business confidence because investors don't know what to invest anymore because it changes the game in terms of the way people spend money. So all of these are arguments about perception, about the way that excessive spending would be perceived. But there are arguments such as inflation arguments that say that excessive government spending then leads to an increase in inflation, which then causes a collapse in the economy, or there are a litany of different impact scenarios. But the point is all these disads are different, and just pulling up your generic blocks will not work out well for you. Now, the unemployment disadvantage, as we discussed previously, is just an argument about work ethic. But with time investment, it can turn into an incredibly threatening argument. So the basics of it is that it would lead to a decrease in employment. But within the employment literature itself, there is a huge debate as to the effects of a decreased number of people pursuing work in the workplace and the huge negative effects that will have. So you could just generate a small disadvantage based on people not working anymore. It means that more people will be in poverty, or it will have X harm. But there are also tons of articles discussing why less people pursuing work would have impacts far beyond just those individuals and would spread all across the economy and all across the United States and even perhaps the world. Now, the automation disadvantage. There are arguments as to why, if we were to institute a UBI, it would allow employers to just use that as an excuse to fire workers, as we discussed previously, and just replace them with automated robots. People are expendable, and workers then have an excuse to fire individuals without feeling any regret. Now, this is also another internal link to the unemployment disadvantage, but it can also have some external impacts. There are, again, research and articles out there that discuss that. So let's talk about the NEG Philosophy Areas. The first one is a Kant or libertarianism argument about how taxation-based arguments, which is how the UBI would be funded, is an unjust reallocation of wealth. Taxes are a violation of people's freedom because they forcefully take your wealth and give it and redistribute it to other people. That is a violation of your freedom. The other argument is a Catholic social theology argument. Now, you should read A Living Wage and a Guaranteed Employment Counterplan, and it will make sense once I explain it. This NC claims that work has more dignity than handouts. There's an intrinsic value to work, and that ownership is a good thing. There's a necessary value to work. A UBI turns them into objects of charity because a UBI sees them as people in poverty and that the government has to help them or extend their working hand. Rather, People who are not working, it is not their fault, but society's fault that they are not working, and that we should be able to give them the dignity of that work instead of just treating them as charity cases, which is why if you read a guaranteed employment counterplan and a living wage counterplan, it would enable people to have employment and have that dignity while via the living wage, which recognizes the value to their work. So the NEG Counterplan areas are incredibly, incredibly important on this topic, and they will often be, I believe, one of the biggest. They will be the biggest harm to affirmative strategy because there are some definitely devastating counterplans in the topic literature. The first one that comes to mind is the negative income tax. This counterplan gets an entire slide because it is one of the most important counterplans in the topic literature that affirmatives need to have a strategy against. So the NIT and the UBI functionally result in the same thing. They all give you back a set sum of money, and the only difference is how it occurs. That how is incredibly significant and definitely generates huge net benefits and disadvantages to the affirmative, which is why their distinctions are important. Now, an easy way to think about this is the following. If you went to a restaurant and had to pay the bill of $35, a UBI would have the restaurant hand you $10 in cash, and you could use that to pay your bill. A negative income tax would just have the restaurant give you a $10 discount, so you'd only have to pay a sum total of $25. At the end of the day, you only have to pay $25 out of your own pocket. Now, how does this translate into real policy? A UBI would hand you a check in cash, with the cash which you could spend on your own, and ultimately you could spend it to your own will. But the point is that they are giving you money. It is an increase in your current income because they are supplementing it. Now, a negative income tax would functionally be a tax break that would allow people to keep a certain sum of money from taxation, which means that you are still receiving the same amount of money just via a different means. Now, why is this distinction important? The politics disad is devastating in conjunction with the negative income tax. A politics disad is an argument about why the plan's perception or its political palatability will influence other things in the political process, or it will have some other political ramification. There are excellent cards, specifically in a David article, which you will find from your lab leaders, about how a negative income tax would be more politically palatable than a universal basic income. Now, the universal basic income is just perceived as a massive spending increase because it's just seen as handing people a check, which is an extension of the current welfare state. Imagine Republicans approving a multi-billion, potentially trillion-dollar program that just hands people money. Trump could collude with the Russians and potentially not be impeached, but if he increased taxes to pay for UBI, he would be impeached in a heartbeat. Republicans would turn on him, and this is incredibly important for all politics disadvantages. Now, it's also important to understand that this is incredibly popular amongst progressives and leftists. So that is definitely relevant in terms of the another kind of politics disadvantage, such as an appeasement disad, in which Trump passing the UBI would be seen as a compromise or would be seen as giving in to leftists, and then they would give him free rein and allow him to do what he wants, which would then allow him to pass harmful policies because the left isn't as incentivized to stop him now. Another form of a politics disad could be that a bill is popular right now, and potentially the plan's unpalatability means that it wouldn't pass. But you would have to find a bill that Trump supports that ultimately would lead to positive effects. Now, other than that counterplan, there are tons and tons of other counterplans on this topic. And answers to these are super important. Researching what all advantage counterplans there are to poverty, to economic insecurity are important because there are a laundry list of different proposals that people have advocated for, and having answers or at least reasons why your internal link is key are definitely things that need to be planned out before the debate. For the negative, that means that you should choose 1 to 2 counterplans and know more about it. The problem with the AFF is that the AFF has the burden of writing answers to every single one of these counterplans. You get to choose 1 or 2 of them, research them in depth, and know so much more about them than the affirmative, which then means that you have an advantage because you've had this debate 100 times, and the AF has the responsibility of defending themselves against a litany of different counterplans. There are a couple of different examples. If you debated the Jan-Feb topic from 2 years ago, I believe, there was the living wage counterplan. It's almost a flipping of sides in that debate. The living wage counterplan would just increase the minimum wage to a livable wage, which should be sufficient for for people's current living standards or the cost of living that they have. It's functionally an increase in minimum wage counterplan and is definitely a counterproposal to the universal basic income, and they're often discussed in conjunction amongst many economists. The next one is the near universal basic income, or the NUBI. Now, what is this? A near universal basic income gives a universal basic income to everyone except for the rich. So there would be a certain income bracket which would not receive the universal basic income. And the net benefit would merely be not providing these people, well, one, it would be less spending, so potentially a spending argument, although the size of the link and the link differential may not be significant. Another argument is that simply handing the rich a check doesn't recognize the uniqueness in giving people who are poor or in poverty a check and recognizing their humanity and the distinction between that and giving it to the rich. Now, what do you do when the AF specifies their funding mechanism to the extreme? So as we discussed previously, there are proposals such as the carbon tax, which people have talked about as a way to discuss the universal basic income. Now, if you see affirmatives that do this, you will often also experience that they will generate advantages based on that. So, for example, a global warming advantage about how a carbon tax would incentivize a shift in energy priorities to more renewable forms of energy or to natural gas, which would be able to solve warming. Now, the negative is obviously not prepared to get into this debate, given that it's a universal basic income and your initial thought, or at least your research, would not lead you to a carbon tax. There's an easy way to resolve this. Via NEG counterplans, you can just counterplan out of the funding mechanism, but not institute a universal basic income. So, for example, you could still have a carbon tax, but you would not need a universal basic income in conjunction with that. You could just use taxation and use that money somewhere else. That would be able to solve the advantage of the carbon tax, which means that it's no longer a relevant concern. And the debate is back focused on the universal basic income. Now, the last slide is about NEG critical areas. There's tons of literature regarding people's dependency on the welfare state. Often it describes how when people are subjected to the welfare state or people are dependent upon it, it gives the United States an excuse to do what they want, i.e., break into their homes and do random searches for drugs, be incredibly rough or violent with them in terms of the police interactions because they are dependent upon them, and if they were to speak out of turn or fight against, they would lose the dependency that they currently have. Now, there's some search terms that are good to use are biopower and paternalism regarding this, as a lot of literature discusses why that dependency is just an extension of the state's power or the state's desire to dominate people. The second argument is the CAPK. While not the most intuitive argument, the Waldman article discusses how the UBI feeds into the free market and sacrifices other progressive reforms. It's similar to the Trump link argument that we talked about earlier, to where it will placate progressives or leftists, which means that other radical reforms would not be instituted. There are other arguments as to why, when the UBI is instituted, it cedes all free market limitations. It gives you a blank check and prevents any state intervention, which is literally feeding the free market and legitimizing it, forcing people to become more dependent. Another good link argument is regarding the UBI's ability to calculate what it means to live a good life in monetary terms. If we remember previously what we discussed, the UBI has to be calculated according to a certain cost of living or certain social standard, and that ability to calculate it commodifies value and forces people to be defined, or at least their value to be defined, by money, and that inevitably forces them to be boxed within financial terms, and sees their value through that financial institution. Now, we've gone through a lot of different arguments, but my recommendation is that you stick to the core of the topic arguments initially, as they will lead you to other areas that you can explore. You will find that poverty and the very core parts of the debate and understanding them in depth is necessary before you jump to any other parts of the topic literature. So brushing up on your basic economics, understanding the topic lit in depth is necessary to be successful on this topic. And I hope this topic overview gives you some sort of insight into the core aspects of the debate.